Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's forum, the 10th in our weekly series, where we are looking at issues of impacting the mental health of LGBT people of color. And my name is Antoine Craigwell, and I'm the president and CEO of DBGM, which is an organization that was founded to raise awareness of mental health issues impacting Black gay men so as to prevent their suicide. And one of the things that DBGM has decided to do is expand its mission to focus on other issues surrounding mental health and other aspects of our LGBTQ people of color communities. This evening's conversation is focusing on domestic violence, domestic and intimate partner violence. And I'm joined in this evening's discussion by four members of our community. There is Dr. Zoe Mckenna, there's Christine Perumal, there is Simone Jing, and there is Joy Agness. You will notice from the flyers that we've shared is that our presenters this evening are four women, because we know that women are often at the brunt of domestic violence. You will also notice that this evening we don't have any men doing a presentation. And there could be a couple of reasons for that. One is that the issue of shame and stigma about being in a domestic or intimate partner violence same-sex relationship is too much, and their masculinity or their manhood may not be able to tolerate that, or that there may be so many men who have not come to terms with their sense of manhood and masculinity and the role that plays in domestic violence or intimate partner violence. However, I would suggest that at a later forum, we may consider doing another discussion on domestic violence, and this time we'll try to include some men. But this evening's forum, our four presenters will share with us personal experiences. They will share with us how the law interacts, or what the law says, and how does the law and when does the law become involved. And then finally, our Dr. McCants is going to talk with us about how does domestic and intimate partner violence impact our mental health, and what does it make us do? How does it affect our life choices? How does it affect our decision-making ability? And especially during COVID-19, when we are in restrictions and lockdown, because remember, domestic and intimate partner violence has existed, and has existed long before COVID-19. But how then has COVID-19, with the impositions, the lockdown, exacerbated the stress and the tension that comes with this? How many of members of our communities live in environments where they feel trapped, where they feel they have no one or nowhere to go, nothing to turn to? At the end of this presentation, we will share with you the slides. And on the slides that you're looking at, there is a list of domestic violence and intimate partner violence resources with phone numbers and websites and so forth for you to access. And even if it's not for you directly, we will urge you to share it with someone who needs to know, who needs to be able to walk away. And I say this because I have myself become aware of the presence of domestic violence in my own family. And one of my family members for years has been abused by her husband. And now she's in her 70s and she refused to leave him. And in the process, all of her children have abandoned her. So with that saying, I'd like to take a look at our program. That following this slide is a memorial, some housekeeping, and then each of our presenters will speak and share about different aspects under the umbrella theme of Behind Closed Doors. So I'd like us to take a moment in silence just to think about and to remember those members of our communities who have been murdered by the police, or the members of our community who were killed by loved ones, and those members of our community who died from COVID-19. Thank you. And now for some community agreements. We'd like to ask everyone to keep their microphones muted. We ask you not to take any photos of the screen because some people's videos may be on and they may not want it to be known that they are on an event like this for their own confidentiality and privacy. We ask you to be respectful of everyone participating, even if you disagree. We ask that you use the chat box at the top right hand on the screen for questions. Please leave your questions in the chat box and indicate if for a specific speaker or if a general question for everyone, and I will read it out. At the end of this forum, we will share the slides and recordings with everyone on request, and or if you want, you can send a question or comment to info@dbgm.org. Our first presenter is Simone Devi Jing. She's the co-director of Jahajee Sisters. Simone is an artist, social entrepreneur, and embodied leadership coach who brings knowledge and expertise in program development, resource mobilization, organizational change, and event production. For over a decade, she has supported youth of color in NYC to become cultural and community organizers, and has led transformational leadership development programs for women of color to center their healing. She has produced the dynamic cultural events to create a platform for artists of color. Community members, I'd like us to welcome Simone Devi Jing. Simone?
Good evening, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here tonight with all of you and to be sharing this forum with all these amazing panelists. So again, my name is Simone Devi Jing, and I'm the co-director of Jahajee Sisters. And for some of you who may not know about us and the work that we do, I'd just like to share a little bit. So Jahajee Sisters is a gender justice organization that supports survivors of intimate partner and sexual violence to heal, cultivate inner resilience, and become bold, courageous, feminist leaders who are organizing to uproot patriarchy in the Indo-Caribbean community. Our work was catalyzed by the murders of several young Indo-Caribbean women who lost their lives to gender-based violence from 2007 through 2019. Natasha Raymond, Gayatri Hardat, Amrita Khan, Rajwanti Baldeo, Marion Singh, Stacy Singh, Donna Rahana Joy, and so many whose names we do not know. I say their names so we don't ever forget them. They are the reason that I and so many at Jahajee Sisters do this work. I'm gonna take a deep breath. It always makes me really emotional when I say their names. So just thinking about this moment, right? The 2020 pandemic has disrupted much of the sense of normalcy that we've all known, right? It's caused economic devastation and disconnected so many of us from our families, our support systems, and created just so much uncertainty. It has forced many of us to become caregivers and homeschoolers, all while managing our work, our anxiety, and our ability to support ourselves and our loved ones to thrive. But for survivors, all of this has intensified by tenfold. They found themselves stuck at home with their abusers without the normal escapes of being able to leave their home for work or for school. And we learned from many of the anti-violence organizations that we have partnered with that calls to them have dropped, There were often many creative measures put in place so they could figure out how to support their clients at this time. For Jahajee Sisters, we've always had an emergency fund set up to support survivors in crisis, whether they were fleeing and needed resources for their moves, for childcare, to rent a place. This has always been in place for us, right? But we've since expanded the scope of the fund to give financial assistance to Indo-Caribbean and gender fluid people who've been struggling as a result of the pandemic. We've received so many calls for support in these last few months. To date, we've helped over 40 women and GNC people and have given out close to $20,000 in financial support. But we've also listened to some of the most gruesome and heartbreaking stories from women about violence that was perpetrated against them. In May, we helped a survivor leave her abusive husband, pack up all of her things, and move out of her home in New Jersey with an 8-month-old baby to be closer to her family in Queens, New York. Last week, we helped a survivor who took a cricket bat to her head from her husband multiple times as her child watched. She ended up in the hospital and thankfully was able to survive this and was discharged home with a few stitches on her head. And when I think about my own story of being a survivor, I can't imagine what it would have been like for me to have been stuck at home with him for 3 months with no connection to my family or my community. In 2007, right when I co-founded Jahajee Sisters, I was in an abusive relationship. As I was co-creating a much-needed space for Indo-Caribbean survivors to break the silence and shame around their lived experiences with intimate partner and sexual violence, I was also navigating a really painful place in my own life. The year before, I met a young Indo-Caribbean brother who appeared to have it all together. He was intelligent, ambitious, charming, and had great taste in music. But just a month into the relationship, everything started shifting. This wasn't the same person I first connected with. He was jealous and he was controlling. I was receiving multiple texts and phone calls at all hours of the day, including my work line, and he was constantly checking up on me. When I wouldn't answer the calls or texts, there would be a huge argument, and he would show up at my parents' house. At that time, I was still living at home. I was walking on eggshells around this person with the sense that anything I did or didn't do would make him snap, and it felt really scary. My family began to notice and worry. They knew something wasn't right about the situation. I knew he came from an abusive household, so I kept making all the excuses that he had a lot he was working through. And often this protecting and wanting to believe this person could change just led to my own detriment. It kept me in the relationship even as things escalated and got worse. I suffered silently, ashamed to talk to anyone about what I was experiencing. It was having an impact on my emotional well-being and my focus at work. I didn't feel like me anymore, and it was starting to show to the people closest to me. Most importantly, I understood firsthand the isolation and despair that came from being in that relationship, which is only intensified for so many survivors in our community during this pandemic, right? Thankfully, by having Jahajee Sisters, I was able to draw on the collective resilience and strength to leave my abuser, but that may not be the case for so many. So I'd like to just close by sharing that Jahajee Sisters is here. It's here even when doors close and no one sees you or hears you. We can see you and we can hear you. We are a resource and we can offer a nurturing community and support system if you are struggling right now. Please reach out. Reach out to us if you need the support. We have an emergency fund that can resource you with financial assistance. We are offering virtual support groups, and we have a mental health counselor who can provide one-to-one support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone. And you actually finished before time, but I'm always grateful because we never know how much time we'll need towards the end. Our next presenter this evening is Joy Agness. As a licensed clergy, Joy provides services for life's events throughout the US and Canada. She's a certified motivational speaker and public speaker trainer and speaks often about women's rights, domestic violence, and human rights issues. With a doctorate in theology and a degree in psychology from the University of West Indies and her experience, she's an adjunct professor at the Miami-Dade and Broward colleges where she provides instructions in weddings and events. Community members, I'd like us to welcome Joy. Joy?
Good evening, everyone. Antoine, I want to thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this evening's forum. You know, I am listening to Simone, and you can hear the emotion in her voice, even though she's not showing it. But there's a lot of emotion. And yes, women, we go through a lot. And we're talking about behind closed doors. I left Guyana, the country of my birth, got into Canada, worked at the Guyana consulate, stayed with my cousin and her husband, who sexually raped me twice. I had to succumb to that because in Canada, it's a strange country. I've never been there before. And you're leaving your home, and then you have to put up with this. And the funny thing about it, not funny to laugh at, but just figure of speech, the funny thing about it is that no one ever believes when you say to them that this particular individual is doing this to you. And he, at one point in time, he's now deceased, said to me, he says, no one would believe you because you're not really anybody, but I am George Cummings, so people would believe me. And to extend and extort that sort of a power over someone, it makes you feel less than in one way. You become inferior in your mind of what is going on. You're beginning to question yourself of how strong and how stable you are. I lived through that. That did not define me because when I left Guyana teaching. And why I'm saying that is to show that this can happen to anybody. Any one of us can succumb to that. But that did not stop me from being who I am or wanted to be who I am. And I pursued my life knowing that that was in my past and it should stay there. That's what I taught. But as time and years go by, I realized that there are a lot of young women and a lot of women on the whole that succumb to these sort of behaviors. Very sad. I was reading yesterday on Facebook of a situation in Guyana where one man referred to it as a bedroom situation. No, that cannot be a bedroom situation when you're abusing somebody. Anything beyond someone's consent is abuse. And we women fall prey to that a lot of times. It could be for economical reasons, it could be for physical comfort, it could be for social reasons. It depends on what it is. But at the same point in time, we can't allow that or that particular frame to define who we are. So I moved on. And the first time I spoke about this, because as you rightfully said, Antoine, I am in the wedding event industry and I do my business internationally as well as nationally. And in having a conversation with one of my dear friends, he says to me, why don't you tell people about this? And I said, no, I didn't want to talk about it. And there was a young woman sitting next to me and she says, I wish you'll talk about it because then I'll be able to know how to handle my situation. You see, the thing is, she was living in a home with her stepfather. Now, the mother knew that the stepfather used to do what he did to this child and said nothing. When confronted with the situation, she said that she never said anything because she did not want him to leave home to go anyplace else. Now, could you imagine at that age and stage of your life at 22, you are succumbed to such a behavior? The only thing you were thinking of, like she said to me at that point in time, I just want to commit suicide. I said, no, you wouldn't. There are people you can talk to and places you can go to make this happen for you. Stand firm. The darkest hour is just before dawn. And you can make it. I said, you can survive it. I survived this and you can survive it. And I want people to know it in the sound of my voice, even though it's an embarrassing situation, even though it's a situation where no one believes you, even though it's a situation where you feel to yourself that you're not going to make it out of it, you will make it out of it. There are people out there like Simone and others that can make it happen for you. You've got counselors like myself that we can even provide situations for you to be able to become an overcomer in this situation. I just lost one of my, I want to say my client. She called me up and she says, I don't want to be in the same house with my husband because he was mentally and verbally abusive to her. And she says, I am not going to succumb to this. So with COVID-19, they are locked in together because they really can't get out. We all can't get out to do anything. And the sad thing about it, she leaped through the 6th floor window and now she's not with us. So that's just to show you the extent of some of the things that people have to go through or they succumb to. And suicide is very high on our rating right now in South Florida because a lot of people are doing that to escape situations. You know, when you are a victim, you also become victimized because a lot of times when you may tell people or share your story with people, if it's a man that's not thinking, and I call it careless thought, they feel to themselves, well, oh, maybe you must have portrayed something for someone to want to do that to you. I beg to differ. In my own situation, I did not do anything for that to happen. Unfortunately, it has caused a big rift in my family. And so now I'm X'd out of that, which it doesn't matter. In life, when you're fighting for something, especially for yourself, you have to stand up. You have to be strong. It's not the easiest role, but support is always there. All you have to do is to look for support. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All you have to do is look for support. It's not the easiest thing to do because everybody, sometimes they'll tell you, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to be a part of it because I have been there. Oh, I don't want to hear this story because I know this individual very well. And I don't want my memory of this individual to be tarnished by this story. Are you sure that this happened to you? Now, how could you not be sure when something happened to you? Of course you're sure. But then now it starts to put doubt and fear in your mind as to what is going on around you. And you know for a fact that it has happened. So it's there, it's very prevalent. It's a lot we can do now in today's society. There's a lot of help out there that can be given. And more people are becoming aware of what's going on around us and within us. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Joy. Our next presenter is Christine Perumal. She's an attorney and she is a director at Safe Horizon Domestic Violence Project. She oversees a program consisting of attorneys and paralegals who focus on counseling and representing low-income survivors of intimate partner violence in family, supreme, and integrated domestic violence courts throughout the 5 boroughs in New York City. She was a former prosecutor in the Administration for Children's Services in the Family Court Legal Services Division in Queens County, and was also a former co-founder partner of Perumal and Vaz LLC, a law firm that focused solely on family and matrimonial law throughout New York City and Long Island. Community members, I'd like us to welcome Christine. Christine?
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be with you all today and to see so many familiar faces who I worked with in the community, like Simone and Jahajee Sisters. I also want to acknowledge that how brave it is for Simone and Joy to just get into their personal stories revolving around domestic violence. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing that. So like Antoine said, I'm an attorney with Safe Horizon, and many of you may have heard about Safe Horizon. Safe Horizon is the nation's leading victim assistance organization, and I oversee a program that helps survivors of domestic violence in family court and Supreme Court. Much of our role during this pandemic has been assisting individuals specifically get consultations and also file orders of protection in family court. And like Antoine said in the beginning, COVID has really exacerbated many of the clients who we work with We predominantly work with only low-income survivors who are 200% of the federal poverty guideline. So they are very low-income survivors. And COVID has caused even more food insecurities and housing insecurities. And this really impacts a survivor's decision to move forward in the legal process, just because there is more of a reliance on the abuser if they are living with the abuser. So right now, as many of you may know, courts are virtual. So now during this pandemic, family courts are all operating on an emergency basis, and orders of protection are considered emergencies. So luckily, we do have a forum and we do have access to the courts where we're able to file orders of protection. Now, the barrier is communication with the survivor. During this pandemic, since the survivor may be living in close corners with the abuser, it is very difficult for the survivor to reach out and receive any help whatsoever. They've lost their support system. Because of COVID, they're unable to leave the home, and they're very scared to leave the home. If they have children, they want to safeguard their families as much as possible. So at Safe Horizon, what we did was we developed a chat system. What I found in the beginning of this pandemic in about mid to late March, I was receiving a lot of emails, and I had never received such a high number of emails. Usually we would see survivors at the family justice centers or at shelters or at different spaces where we would sit. And what I found was that survivors were sending very short emails asking for help and advice about divorce or orders of protection, or any places they could go for shelter, or if we could provide them with some type of housing. Now, as the pandemic has progressed and the restrictions are loosening a little bit, it is a little bit easier for survivors to make a phone call. So what we're seeing is sometimes survivors will go to this grocery store and they call our program or the courts, and they can ask for assistance from an attorney or a clerk to draft an order of protection, and for that order of protection to then be put in front of a judge the same day, and for a judge to make the determination as to whether or not they should receive an order of protection. Now, once we kind of explain the process of an order of protection to a client, and they know that the abuser has to be served with the order of protection in order for it to become effective, that kind of puts the brakes on what a survivor is going to do, because now we're seeing that survivors have nowhere to go and they're living with the abuser. And sometimes serving an abuser with an order of protection may exacerbate the issues that are going on in the house. They may become even more irate, and that's problematic. So if a survivor has no safe place to go, sometimes they do not want us to file orders of protection, unfortunately, but we, at the beginning of every conversation, are having to safety plan, as we always do, to ensure that we are always, making new plans for survivors within their space. The courts have been good with hearing these orders of protection. I think that domestic violence has received a lot of media attention. And so, I think that there is a sense that, there's liability there, and that we need to hear as many cases as we can to ensure survivor safety. When we speak to a survivor, we've heard some pretty terrible stories and just terrible abuse happening within homes, and survivors still staying in the home because of this virus, and just not wanting to uproot their children, mainly, is what we're seeing, and to bring them to a shelter. And also, there is no shelter space in many of the shelters in New York City, and many family members are not offering their homes because of safety concerns. So we do unfortunately hear from survivors that they'd rather stay in the abusive relationship for now, to wait out this pandemic, to see if things get better. We always tell survivors that they're the expert in their own lives, and that we always safety plan. What may seem like a bad plan for us may actually, in fact, be a good plan for the survivor. But we always ensure that, you know, a survivor is connected with a counselor. We address mental health concerns, you know, at the beginning of a conversation. And I think a lot of our attorneys, while they are attorneys, are having to wear different hats during this pandemic and to really look at this holistically. Because if a survivor is not comfortable with engaging in the court process, there are other steps we need to take to ensure their safety. And then for, you know, the court system in general, you know, once we engage in a court case, we always have to curb or manage a survivor's expectations as to how survivors will, how this litigation will really play out. The one thing that I have to say about the court system is that I wish that judges were a little bit more trauma informed in how they, you know, look at cases. And a lot of our survivors have PTSD, and they're unable to remember a lot of things once we go through litigation. And sometimes this can be held against them because of, you know, lack of being trauma informed. Also, I think that I wish that, you know, judges were more culturally sensitive, and we have to also tell this to our clients, especially with practicing in Queens. The bench is not very diverse, and sometimes you have to explain to a client that maybe the cultural sensitivity will not be there when you're in front of a judge. And so, you know, during pre-COVID and even during this pandemic, we have to remind survivors that once you engage in court, we can never really guarantee the outcome of a case. While we advocate relentlessly and we have a great group of attorneys, you know, judges, you know, are humans too and are people, and they come to their own determinations based on the evidence and how they perceive the facts in front of them. I think I ended a little early there, Antoine.
Really? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. Zoe Mckenna. She is a licensed mental health counselor with concentrations in leadership, counselor education, trauma-informed care, and social justice. Licensed to practice in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. She's also a certified trauma-informed specialist and yoga teacher. She's an advocate for underserved populations, LGBTQI+ populations, and women's wellness. She served as a keynote speaker, trainer, and consultant for organizations and events in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania area. Community members, I'd like us to welcome Dr. Zoe Mckenna. Dr. Mckenna.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I hope you all can hear me well. And thank you to Simone and Joy for sharing your stories. I know it takes courage to always share, just as Christine said. So I'm going to go over the part about mental health aspects and how our mental health is impacted by domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So first, what I'll do is I'll go over some of the signs of physical abuse, and then I'll talk about emotional abuse, and then lastly, I'll touch on some areas that we don't really talk about a lot, which is economic abuse, and then I'll go into those mental health factors. So for physical abuse, there's that idea that you have a partner who's in front of you who's damaging property when they're angry. Perhaps they've thrown objects or punched the wall or kicked the door. If they pushed, slapped, biting or kicking, abandoning a partner in a dangerous place or unfamiliar place, driving recklessly to scare their partner, so using it's a weapon to threaten or hurt their partner. In addition to that, I would also add the idea of just trying to to scare you, a scare tactic. So having weapons out in order to scare. Having to trap the person in their home, so perhaps they lock you in and you can't get out, or so preventing the partner from calling police or seeking any medical attention. Let's go on to the next one is emotional abuse. So that would entail name calling, insults, continual criticism. And we all know the difference between constructive feedback and someone who's being really negative and derogatory to us. Being extremely jealous or possessive, isolation from family or friends, having to monitor where you go or who you spend time with, withholding affection or as a punishment. So if the partner knows that you've been texting them or calling them, then they'll withhold that from you. They threaten to hurt you, your family, a child, or even perhaps like a pet. Also, there's a way to humiliate a partner in any other way. And what that could include, and what I've seen in modern day, that I've had clients that talk to me about their partner who would put up humiliating like things about them on social media and won't take the post down, so the person feels very degraded and humiliated and doesn't want to talk to any friends and feels as if they can't defend themselves. They also feel as if they have to ask for permission to do certain things, especially if they live with the person. Under economic abuse, you have controlling access to financial information, any refusal to share money. So perhaps, this person is the one who's the caretaker and stays at home, and the abuser is the one who has the job and has means to the finances. So then they're not sharing that, or preventing the partner from being able to keep their job, or saying, oh, you don't have to work a full-time job, you need to be home a little bit more or tend to household needs. If the person does make money, then they can take the money from that particular partner, or not allowing their name to be on any account or having any information about the account. So then what that does is it doesn't help the person to learn about financial assets or how to gain credit or do anything, because nothing is in their names. And they demand to see all purchases. So there have been times when you've had survivors who've had to hand in receipts or say, oh, I bought certain things, or they monitor what's being bought from a checking account. And as we go into like the mental health effects of DV and IPV, it's important to know that it's a rush of emotions that are experienced. And some of those emotions are like fear, confusion, anger, it's the feeling of being numb or not feeling anything at all. And there's also that guilt and that shame over being assaulted, not wanting to share that information with anyone because they feel who was going to understand the situation, or why did I allow this to happen. In some instances, you have women who do minimize the abuse by thinking that the person, had a history of abuse in their family, or they make excuses for them, or they hide their bruises from their family and their friends. So some long-term mental health effects for physical violence and emotional abuse in relationships is post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. So one of the things about trauma-informed care is that the person who is sitting in front of me, the client, the survivor, it's how they perceive an event. So trauma is perception. It's how you perceive what has happened to you. So if you perceive that event was traumatic, then you're going to voice it as such. The idea of the clinician being trauma-informed is that I am not making a decision for the client or the survivor. I am allowing them to speak freely about what has happened. And my job is to understand that trauma-informed care is going to include patience. It's going to include taking our time to get to certain areas, having to understand how the body sensations respond to trauma, how the emotions respond to trauma. What's important also about trauma is that, I've had twofold cases, and you have one person who's experienced domestic violence or physical abuse or emotional abuse. And if you attach the word trauma to it, they may not understand it as such. One person told me, well, I didn't experience it as trauma. I just figured it was a relationship because that's how men are. And so for them, it wasn't an idea of this was a traumatic event for me until they took the time to look at the signs and what happened and not wanting to be in that type of relationship again and how it affected them emotionally and mentally. So post-traumatic stress, we know there's an experience of trauma. There's some shock in there. There's trying to relive that experience over and over again. It's feeling tense, being on edge, having some difficulty sleeping, out-of-body experiences, having nightmares, angry outbursts, being forgetful about the events that took place, cannot go back and retract the entire relationship or the events that were traumatizing to them. Depression, as we know, is loss of interest in activities. It's feeling down and lethargic. It's a sadness that cannot necessarily just go away. So a person who is trying to cope with what they're going through and not being able to find joy in anything. One of the other areas where I talk about depression is that it's not only just like this relentless sadness, but it's also a loss of hope, a loss of self-worth, a loss of confidence. It's also some physical attributes, and sometimes you hear people talk about migraines or stomach issues, digestion issues. They thought their heart is palpitating. And that also leads into anxiety, where there may be some panic attacks in there, or intense feeling on edge all the time, or having thoughts that are constantly racing and feeling jittery. So those things can happen as long-term effects from domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Other effects could be a social withdrawal. So you're shutting out other people in your family, your friends, feeling intense fear all the time, to not feeling as if you can go out and enjoy anything anymore because now you're always on guard and you're looking over your shoulder, almost like a sense of paranoia, not being able to trust other people, and definitely having that sense of low self-esteem and self-worth. So you have had many women who have experienced some form of physical violence or emotional abuse have used drugs and alcohol to cope. And I think the statistic is about 90% of women who are substance abusers have experienced some sort of physical or sexual abuse in their lifetime. The thing is that we tell clients all the time, the survivors, that the substance abuse may help you in the moment, but in the long term, it has worse effects on them. And then there's some other ways that the other effects of violence on women. You have work, as I talked about before. Some people will withdraw from work. They may not show up on time and may not be able to focus while they are at work, have a difficult time trying to just do their job and to remain on task. And I believe the statistic says that the number of women who've experienced some sort of domestic violence or emotional abuse who have quit their job, it was a total loss of $250,000 a year. For a home, you have many women who leave their homes, outside of the pandemic, but if they do, then they're going into shelters or they're trying to find a friend who will take them in. And then you have school, like I work in a college, so I deal with a lot of young college students who are between 18 and 24 years old. And a lot of times they do report coercion and date rape, but they don't necessarily come and report it to the professionals in the school. They'll talk to a friend before they actually report. So sexual assault goes uncounted for many years. And lastly, you have some women will stay in a domestic violence relationship if they feel like their partner will take their children away. So having access to their children is very important, and they're not going to want to leave that relationship and leave their kids there with the person who is the abuser. So I ended kind of early, so I know there probably like some time for questions. I figured like 15 minutes for questions, so we go from there.
Thank you guys very much. This is remarkable because, Dr. McCants, thank you very much, because as you were speaking, questions were coming in, and there were a number of questions and thoughts were going through my mind. I know that we've had a few questions come in, and I saw that Christine has answered 2 of them. And so I'll just read the questions for those who may be listening on the phone. And so the questions were, Christine, is there any way that you can consult a trauma expert in the courts, example, as a witness? And Christine responded, yes, in litigation, we can bring in an expert and sometimes a survivor's doctor to address the PTSD or trauma that the survivor has experienced. This is done in an effort to explain why a survivor may not remember certain events or dates accurately or even explain certain behavior. Another question was, Ms. Perimal, I was wondering how you might suggest encouraging a survivor to participate in domestic violence therapy, etc. As a CASA, we encounter many families who are exposed to domestic violence, and part of their DFCS reunification plan is to participate in these programs. What do you suggest when a parent refuses to participate in these programs or even acknowledge violence that happened to both her and the children, but that is required for them to be reunited with their children? Thanks. Christine responds, yes, unfortunately, we cannot force a client to engage in therapy. We always explain the impact it could have on their case, the way the court may view their inability to acknowledge the violence that has happened to their family, etc. We usually try to tell the survivor that court is a stressful place and the court will force co-parenting to some extent. So therapy may offer valuable ways of addressing the stress and offering co-parenting techniques. Thank you very much for those 2 questions, and Christine for answering those. One of the things that came up that came up consistently in all of your presentations is the impact of culture. That cultural norms and cultural practices do play a significant role in how domestic violence is actually practiced, or if there's any opportunity for relief, because often it's tied in with cultural norms and cultural expectations and behaviors. I got really interested in domestic violence several years ago when I did a series of 4 articles for a newspaper in Connecticut. And I focused on each in the series. One focused on women as the abused, another one on children who I discovered can be twice victimized or twice abused, about men being the abused, and about in same-sex relationships. In all of your 4 presentations, I could hear hints to all 4 of those articles that I did. Can any one of you talk to us about how children are affected by domestic violence that is taking place in the home? What effect does that have on them? And I know, Dr. McCants, you and Christine, but particularly you, have stressed a lot about the trauma. And I know that Bessel van der Kirk, who spoke about who is a neurobiologist, who talks about trauma's effect on the prefrontal cortex of a person's brain, and that then creates what is called speechless terror and robs somebody of the opportunity to speak. But talk to us a little bit about how are children affected when they witness the adults' violence among the adults, whether it be physical violence, emotional violence, psychological violence, whatever form of violence. Children will recognize it. How does it affect them, and how can we break the cycle so that children then do not go on to perpetuate this, thinking that this is normal behavior?
Right. So with Bessel, yeah, they also talk about adverse childhood experiences. So what we have is something called ACEs, and we do like an assessment with someone, with children or with adults, and we talk about how many environmental factors, cultural factors, what has happened in their home, and what's the score that we give them. So it's basically 10 questions, and it just asks about their total life experience and what are they seeing. So if there's violence in the home, if there's a parent who's been incarcerated, if there's any health issues, have that child been hungry and has food insecurity, is that child also homeless and have housing insecurity? So all those things actually all go into an ACEs score. If that score is like 4 and above, that usually indicates some form of trauma. And that's why you have the New York City Department of Education has so many social workers in school now in order to address adverse childhood experiences. So yes, as you were saying, so children who are witnessing all of this at home, it is impacting their personal development and their growth, as far as the neurobiology behind it, as far as like the prefrontal cortex and their speech development. That all does play a part, especially if they're younger, like under 5 years old. However, when they're school age is what they then take and repeat when they're at school. It depends on how they conceptualize that abuse and what they see on a consistent basis, because some can be bullies, some can, but that's because they see it at home or they're also being abused themselves. And then it's kind of twofold, because it could be abuse where the child is witnessing the abuse. But what the new definition is for PTSD now is that you don't have to actually be the victim of the actual abuse. You can also witness the abuse. So what that says is that for PTSD, it's perception. It's how you perceive the event. So the same thing with the person who's experiencing the actual abuse, you have the person who's now witnessing the abuse. And if that is traumatic for them, then that is considered trauma. And that's why all of us as clinicians or individuals who work in social services have to be trauma informed. And that goes to what you were just talking about, like in any other elements that they have. But those behaviors then come in and acting out in school when you have teachers that think that the students are like, oh, you're misbehaving or you're not listening to me, and they want to diagnose them with oppositional defiant disorder, and they get IEPs and they get behavioral education classes, or they're going to special ed, when they're not actually going in to figure out what's actually happening at home, because environmental factors impact and affect kids in a very prominent way.
Thank you very much, Dr. I think the question, I think maybe Christine and you, Dr. McCants, may be able to shed some light on this. What then now? Let's talk about men who are victims of domestic violence from women or in same-sex relationships. And let's talk about men who are the abusers or other women who are abusers. And like we were talking just now, Dr. McCants, about learned behavior, the cycles of domestic violence is in some respects cyclical. So, and one of the things that we often hear about, that it's always men are the abusers, but we don't hear about men being the abused. We don't hear about other women being the abusers or being the aggressors. So can we talk, how does the law, for example, Christine, view men as abusers or as the abused, or women as the abused? And Dr. McCants, what's going on there in terms of cultural, psychosocial development that impacts men?
So with same-sex couples, I think that I don't really see it that often, to tell you the truth, in family court. And I guess one story I can share with you quite recently is that we were in court with a same-sex couple, and it was an order of protection case. And one of the judges asked our attorney, called her up and asked, did you make sure to identify the victim here? Are you sure that you're representing the victim? And I thought that that was interesting, because that's never a question you really ask when you have a male and a female. And when we have those cases, like I never hear that question. And so it was, it made me think a little as to how some conservative jurists are viewing these type of cases that come before them. And while a jurist is supposed to be impartial, and I, don't ever want to question that. You have to, realize that judges are people also, and that they come to this profession with their own bias, and that you can only hope that, there's nothing, that their bias doesn't really impact the case. But I thought that was quite interesting to hear. And, in terms of us, most of our practice is comprised of survivors who are female. And we do actually see some males come into the family justice centers or other places telling us about the abuse that they've experienced from their partner who is a female. And sometimes it's they tell us a story, and it's almost shameful for them to tell us the story. And, they always, also preface it with, I don't think you're going to believe me because I'm a man. And so I think that's also very interesting. I can't say that I have a lot of males that I see on a consistent basis, but they do call our hotlines, and we do see them. And, the percentage of them bringing a case when we feel like there really may be abuse going on is really small in my experience.
Thank you very much, Christy. Dr. McCants?
Yeah, sure. So that goes to the aspect of the shame and the embarrassment. So, most men are not going to feel as if they're being heard, especially if they're talking about a woman who is the one who's more abusive, or the person who's been abusing them. And that's the shame part of it. They're not going to tell, or if they do tell, they're going to confide in like a hotline, or perhaps a counselor who they could talk to, because they know it's confidential. But in court, I can't count on those numbers, but I know the averages and the statistics state that I think it's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience some sort of severe intimate partner of violence. And I think it's also 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical, like actual abuse in a relationship. So there are numbers on surveys where people are responding, and I think that men are more prone to respond via a survey or that confidential hotline, or confidential in a therapy session, but not necessarily in the courtroom. It definitely has to do with shame.
Thank you. Joy, Simone, you guys, do you feel there's anything you want to add to this? We've got 3 minutes to go. Or depending on our conversation, if you guys are willing, we can continue beyond 7 for a few more minutes. But Joy, Simone, do you have any comments or any thoughts you want to add?
I just want to continue a little bit of what Dr. McCants was saying about kids being traumatized. A lot of times you'll find them being withdrawn, or you'll find them wetting their bed. Some of them would refuse to eat. These are little basic signs that I have picked up during my counseling with other women that were abused or going through that in a home, and the kids are seeing it, because there was a 4-year-old that saw his mom being beaten so badly that you cannot give him any form of red meat. He wouldn't eat it because of the blood and everything. He keeps assimilating that back to his mom being hurt. So there's a lot of trauma that goes on with children, and they are not expressive like adults are. I should say some adults, because even some adults are not really expressive, but they're not that expressive. So you actually have to sit and think of what they're going through and put yourself sometimes in their place and kind of visualize what is going on there.
Thank you, Joy. And I just wanted to add to that, because one of the things that I discovered when I was doing these articles in Connecticut, and when I did the series, the one installment on children, I discovered that in the courts in Connecticut, there is that when someone is brought in, is arraigned before the court, before a judge, the judge then schedules a probation or evaluation to determine if the abuser came from a family that child that might have been in an abusive relationship. Because what the judge has then recognized is that if that is the case, then this abuser is perpetuating the same violence that they experience and witness, like you were talking about, Dr. McCants, in the home among their parents, and now they're perpetuating it and practicing it on their significant others. So then the court process takes on a different aspect. Instead of being punitive and criminal, it becomes more community oriented. Simone, do you want to add anything to this conversation?
No, I don't have anything to add right now. I mean, as someone who's grown up in an emotionally abusive home, I can only speak from my own experience and say I remember feeling very withdrawn and just keeping to myself a lot of the time. So the trauma is real, and I think we carry that for a lot of our life if we're not going through an intentional process of healing to release it.
Thanks. Yeah, because and I mean, both Christine and Dr. McCants, and now you and Joy are really truly bringing up the effect of the violence, the abuse, you know, on as trauma, and how this trauma really does impact everybody from even the abuser all the way down to children. And I'm particularly interested as well in some research that talked about children experiencing trauma, even if it's vicarious trauma, that it creates stress, and the cortisol that's released because of the stress in children affects their development of the hypothalamus and the amygdala in the brains, which then leads to impaired learning, including sleep, including emotional development, and all these other things. So it has a cascade and a continuing effect. I know that we're at 2 minutes after 7, and I have a feeling that this conversation can go on for a while. So I would want us to stop, and maybe we can bring this back again and bring all 4 of you back again. And I hope Dr. McCants is not going to cuss me out again this time. And bring you all back again. And maybe we can have a couple of men who can also be part of the discussion to talk about from the role of the abuser as well as the role of a survivor or victim. And I said so in a previous conversation, I don't want to use that term victim. So maybe we can talk about this again and bring some more men into this. What do you guys think?
Sounds good.
Yeah, that sounds good, because you know the person who is the abuser, you know, they have some form of trauma in their life as well. They didn't just wake up in the morning and become an abuser. They went through something and experienced something. They've seen something, and that's their way of acting out themselves. So they may have experienced that same childhood, that adverse childhood experience, and now it's showing up in relationships. So
Thank
it's important.
Yep, thank you. And I think one of the important things of what we are doing here this evening is this conversation is breaking the shame and the stigma around talking about it, just like it is with mental health. There is so much shame around mental health, but by talking more about it, increasingly more and more people are feeling comfortable to reach out and ask for help. And so similarly with conversations on domestic violence, if we can bring more of this and more of us can talk about it, we can be able to do that. Somebody asked the question, what is the term that is used that refers to children losing their ability to speak as a result of being in a home that has domestic violence? Anybody want to jump in on that quickly?
You said it. I didn't say it. I don't remember it.
I think they're probably talking about
the prefrontal cortex and when
the trauma that affects.
I can't think of it. I'll have to look it up and give it to you. I can send you something and you can share it with us.
It's Bessel van der Kolk talked about speechless terror. I think is what he was talking about, that when the experience is so traumatic that your prefrontal cortex shuts down and you're literally speechless. You literally can't say anything. And I think when Christine was describing the inability to remember stuff in court or even be able to recount what happened, people, the trauma is so intense that maybe it may be another issue to encourage mental health professionals to step in as one of the steps before we get to court. You know what I'm saying, Christine? So
I agree with that. Yeah.
All right. So thank you all very much. And we will share the remainder of the slides with people. The next, we got resources and stuff. So the next set of slides is all resources. The next upcoming forum is next week. We're talking about elderly, and we're talking about elderly and being alone next week. All right. So, Joy, Simone, Christine, and Dr. McCants, thank you all very much. This is, I can hear myself, I'm echoing. So thank you all very much, and we'll be in touch about another forum. All right?
Thank you so much. Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you. Good night.
Okay, bye. Okay. Oh, you guys left? Oh.